Close to 6 months into the pandemic, Starbucks, the country's largest coffee chain, is trying to make your once normal coffee run feel normal again. Dealing with renewed shutdowns and mask mandates, the company is leading with a new approach, according to CEO and President Kevin Johnson.
Right now, what customers want are experiences that are safe, familiar, and convenient.
The Java Giant is serving up a more streamlined experience for customers built around new technology.
Now, we have over 32,000 stores in over 80 markets around the world, and we've developed a digital dashboard that takes feeds from government to help track the spread of COVID. So until there's a vaccine, we are going to be constantly adapting.
In the new pickup-only stores, customers can get their coffee from a safe distance at the touch of a button. Just order on the app, wait for your name, grab it and go. More of these stores, expanded curbside pickup and drive-thrus will be rolled out over the next 18 months. Pretty seamless. The chain is emphasizing new safety protocols, too, though not without challenges.
A big piece for us is, again, safety, making sure the customers and the partners here feel safe. So we do like standard check-ins every day to make sure that the partners fill in like wellness checks. And we also, all of our high-touch areas, because we know customers and partners come into contact, so we make sure that we are frequently cleaning them.
How hard has it been to enforce the mask mandate for your partners, for your employees, to get customers to adhere to these rules?
Beginning in May, we required all of our Starbucks partners to wear facial coverings. We respectfully requested all customers to wear facial coverings in our stores, and candidly, most of them did. But, certainly some didn't. We've partnered with the CDC to make sure we have, an experience that, at least meets and hopefully exceeds the CDC requirements for safety related to COVID-19.
Is this the future for Starbucks indefinitely?
This is reshaping consumer behavior broadly, I believe. And certainly, I think, some of that will continue even after there's a vaccine.
What do you say to those who say, but we're in a crisis. We've loved to put people over profits, but we just can't afford to?
I think we're past the crisis phase and we're now into execution mode. Now, for those who say, look, as we entered this downturn, we want to put people over profit, but we couldn't. We just economically couldn't. And that's where I think, as you said before, we all have a responsibility in this, and we all have to come together and help each other through this.
The new Starbucks, when we make our way out for the morning commute that we've missed for so long, what's the biggest change we'll see? What's the Starbucks surprise?
Well, look, I think after sheltering at home and sheltering in place for so long, I think the ability to come back to a store and enjoy that third place experience in that community is going to be a very rewarding proposition. Now, that's down the road, and right now, I think the digital app, the mobile app, and the safe experiences we've created create a wonderful, uplifting Starbucks experience.
And if we're using the digital app, I'm guessing the likelihood that my barista will get my name right on my cup is probably a whole lot higher now.
Well, you're in control of that now, Stephanie. You're exactly right. That's how that works. It's called personalized experience. You get to personalize it to what you like.
Awesome. Then my coffees, for at least the foreseeable future, will say Wonder Woman on them.
There you go.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.